Okay, we're back with this Tram D201A. This is one I'd done some, had to do some repairs on the B&A board other than, doing the restoration on this. And I got it hooked up, receives okay, went to check transmit power, and right now I have it run through this large coax cable, goes up to a switch, but it ends up at this leader power meter over here, which is also a dummy load. Now it's set at the 5-watt scale. See that? The needle barely moves, and I mean barely moves. And that's on 5-watt scale. Now, I have an oscilloscope probe hooked directly to the coax connector here. And if we look at the oscilloscope here, if you look at the top right corner, there's a analog readout of what's actually being displayed. Yeah, 120 some volts. We have a problem, and I know what it is. Give me a second and I'll show you. Okay, now I had traced that voltage throughout the entire, basically, driver and final circuit till I got to the coax connector. I started basically here, through the input to the driver, out through the final tube, along this RF SWR board. Of course, it goes into the relay. Was fine going in there, fine coming back out of the relay, and then, like I say, eventually I ended up checking right at the input of the coax connector. And it's not my coax cable. Nothing wrong with the coax cable, there's nothing wrong with the meters, nothing wrong with the switches up here. The problem is in the radio. But if it's not in the radio, it's right at the outside. It's a wallowed, whatever the hell you'd want to call it, wallowed out, or deformed coax jack. Now, here's a PL259. It's, of course, kind of hard to see. You see that? It's so damn loose in there. That's the problem. The coax connector on your coax cable is actually not making contact with the female socket there because the 4 contact fingers are so far pushed out they can't really touch. And it depended, because I'd have one minute I'd have a little bit more power than that, and I'd be showing like maybe 90 some volts, because as the load is applied, I think that's what was happening. It was just barely making contact a couple times. I'd just barely get a slight bit of contact. The voltage would start to drop because load's being applied to the circuit, and the RF power would start to come up. I'd show as much as maybe probably a 32nd or a 16th of a watt, but anything was better than what I was showing up there just a moment ago. But yeah, so it finally, I was like, is there something wrong with my meter? So I hooked it up to a different meter. I have plenty of them. Everything's fine. I hooked, that's what it is. If your voltage is good here and you don't have anything out, there's definitely a problem. So, yeah, so it's time for a new coax connector. So just something to be aware of, people. If you're ever troubleshooting one of these and you've got good voltage the whole way through, to the inside, on the inside of your radio, and you even have an oscilloscope hooked up at the connector itself, and for some reason you're not getting anything out, be sure you check this connector. And you can even see, if you look at a new and an old one, how much closer together the contacts are and how far they are. They're spread out in the original one. And when you stick the connector in this one, it's so tight, it actually holds on. Or this one, like I say, it just wobbles around in there. So another quick tip, things to keep a lookout for: faulty coax connectors. Okay, and here is the old and new. This is the old. You see how far apart where you can see the insulation in between the fingers of the jack. And if you look at a new one, what it's supposed to look like in there, you can barely see any of the nylon insulation or Teflon insulation, in between those fingers. And like I say, you can take this jack, even insert it the whole way in where normally that would, you know, you'd be able to pick up the jack. Yeah, it just falls out. So that's all the problem was. Yep, bad jack. And I get the feeling when they sold this radio, they couldn't figure out what was wrong with it, because the customer bought this radio and it had this big label on the top of it. I didn't put that on there, and the customer didn't, because the customer had the seller ship this radio directly to me. That's what was on top. Parts radio, cord inside radio. So, yeah. It looks like they probably sold. Now, don't get me wrong, it needed to be restored. It needed to have, you know, a couple minor repairs done, some circuit traces, you know, cap job, replace the resistors and whatnot. But I think the main fault, other than, like I had said, I had to do a B&A board repair on this because I had no low voltage. But, yeah, between the B&A board low voltage problem and this jack, that's really all that was wrong with it. So, you know, radios that other people have, you know, relegated to the parts pile, a lot of times can be brought back with a, you know, minimum amount of money and, you know, minimum amount of work, you know, or it's going to cost you close to the same as just basically restoring a working radio. You know, if you have one that's working, just needs a cap and re-resistor job, you know, the price difference between that and fixing this one, the only additions were a little bit of repair work on the B&A board and replacing this connector right here. Well, you pick this radio up for, you know, $50 or $100 versus spending, you know, $200-$300 or more on a working one, and still have to do all of this work of replacing all the, you know, resistors, capacitors and whatnot. Save yourself a lot of money doing stuff like that. I often tell people, there's nothing that can't be fixed in these. I've got a graveyard of these radios, so it's not like parts aren't available. You know, even worst case scenario, transformers burned up and, you know, stuff like that, circuit boards burned in half. Just pull a board out of another radio, worst case. But yeah, like I say, this one he got cheap and basically 2 simple repairs. Other than the restoration, the only thing it really needed was a little bit of work on the low voltage side on the BA board and new jack. So there you go. Okay, here it is with the new connector now installed. A little tip when you're installing, you can see it's nice and shiny up there. And test setup's going to be exactly the same. Oscilloscope hooked up to directly at the coax connector. Coax cable runs up to a switch and then over to that power meter. One little tip. When I install these, I always like to fill this barrel with a solder paste. Because, you know, if this thing's been in a parts drawer for a while, they're new, even silver plated, they're going to get a little bit of oxidation. Now, oxidation on the outside is easy to clean off. I can just use a fiberglass brush for that. But it's hard to get down inside the barrel of these connectors to clean that out. And that's where you want the solder to be, to have its best bond, because that's where the wires go in. So like I say, what I use is, instead of just filling it with flux, I actually use a solder paste. You know, has a lot of flux built into it. There's actually very little solder. It's a little bit of solder with a lot of flux. Mainly, I use this for, you know, doing surface mount work. But, you know, I basically fill that barrel with this solder paste, you know, until it's flush with the outside edge. Then I can push the, you know, capacitor lead and the wire lead that comes up off the SWR bridge board, or whatever. You know, it doesn't matter what radio you're working on. But like I say, I fill that up, and so I just find it makes a little bit better connection. But in any case, so the only thing that's been changed between the last time and we had basically no wattage and shitload of voltage, and this time, which we now have wattage and greatly reduced voltage, which is what we should have, because now the radio is being properly loaded with a 50 ohm load, which it wasn't because of that bad connector. It was basically dead keying into the air, more or less. And that little bit of power you saw on the power meter was basically just a little bit of RF energy, because I guess the gap was so small, it was just barely leaching into the cable. So, key the microphone, watch the power meter up there. See, it's showing a little over 3 watts at 39.525 volts. Audio, check, 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 and there's modulated. Audio, check, check, check. Audio, audio. So now I can continue on with the restoration. Actually, the only thing I have left to do, parts-wise, is replace the cap right there. I'll install all modern X and Y rated safety bypass caps. But other than that, the only thing I'll have left to do now is the transceiver alignment. So keep an eye out on those jacks. Not the first time I've seen that problem before.